Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The mountains had always called to me. Since childhood, I'd found solace in the vastness of untamed landscapes. Places where human footprints disappeared with the changing seasons, and where silence had genuine weight. By my late 20s, these wilderness excursions had evolved into a ritual, one I shared with three close friends from college: Jackson, Will, and Bennett. Together, we'd traversed countless trails across North America, from the mist-shrouded paths of the Appalachian Trail to the sun-baked ridges of the Grand Canyon. Our annual hiking trips had become sanctuary from our increasingly complicated lives. We were no longer the carefree college students who could disappear into the backcountry for weeks at a time. Now we had careers, mortgages, and relationships that demanded our presence. These expeditions had become precious interludes, brief returns to a simpler existence. June 2017 marked our planned journey to Yellowstone National Park. I remember checking the weather forecast obsessively in the days leading up to our departure, anxiety building as I watched thunderstorm warnings flashing across my screen. The others had laughed at my meteorological fixation during our video call the night before departure. Weather changes every 15 minutes in the mountains, Jackson had said, his beard now flecked with premature gray. We've hiked through worse. He wasn't wrong. We'd endured blizzards in Colorado and flash floods in Arizona. Weather was as much a part of the wilderness experience as blisters and granola bars, yet something about this trip felt different before it had even begun. A heaviness had settled in my chest, like the atmospheric pressure drop before a violent storm. Will had noticed my uncharacteristic quiet during that call. "Getting cold feet, buddy? We can always hit a resort instead. Room service, hot tubs, overpriced cocktails." His attempt at levity had worked, momentarily dispersing the inexplicable dread I'd been feeling. "And miss the opportunity to smell your unwashed hiking socks for 4 days? "Not a chance," I'd retorted, falling back into our familiar patterns of banter. Bennett, always the most practical of our group, had interrupted our exchange with logistics, departure times, gear checklists, emergency contacts. His methodical nature had saved us more than once over the years, though we'd never admit it to his face. None of us could have anticipated what awaited us in Yellowstone's remote backcountry. The memories of that trip have embedded themselves in my psyche like shards of glass, impossible to extract without causing further damage. Even now, 7 years later, certain sounds or scents can instantly transport me back to those mountains, to the moment when our understanding of wilderness and perhaps humanity itself fundamentally changed. I've struggled with whether to document what happened, whether giving form to these memories might somehow intensify their hold on me, but perhaps confronting them is the only path forward. So I'll begin where all nightmares begin, with an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way except for what would follow. We arrived at Yellowstone's eastern entrance shortly after dawn, having driven through the night in Bennett's aging but reliable SUV. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and mineral-rich soil as we shouldered our packs and checked our GPS coordinates one final time before losing reliable signal. Our destination was a remote alpine lake, nestled approximately 18 miles from the nearest marked trail. The isolation was precisely what had drawn us to this particular location, the promise of pristine wilderness untouched by the typical Yellowstone crowds. According to satellite imagery and topographical maps, the lake sat at roughly 7,200 feet, surrounded by peaks that soared well above 10,000 feet. "Perfect weather for a death march," Will remarked dryly, squinting at the cloudless sky as we began our trek. The first several miles followed an established trail, where we occasionally encountered other hikers, nodding acknowledgments as we passed. By early afternoon, we'd reached our divergence point, where we would leave the marked path and begin navigating by compass and topographical features. "Last chance to turn back," Bennett said, though we all knew it was mere formality. None of us would suggest abandoning our plans this early. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as we pushed further from established routes. What had begun as a gentle incline transformed into steep switchbacks that forced us to use our hands for balance, grasping exposed tree roots and jutting rocks. Our conversation dwindled to occasional grunts and necessary directional calls. By late afternoon, our shirts clung to our backs with sweat, and our legs burned with the effort of the climb. But the scenery rewarded our exertion. Vast expanses of untouched wilderness stretched in every direction, with distant mountains cutting sharp silhouettes against the deepening blue sky. There, Jackson pointed toward a depression between two ridgelines. Should be just beyond that next rise. We arrived at the lake just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. The water stretched before us mirror-still and reflecting the surrounding cliffs in perfect detail. It was smaller than we'd anticipated, perhaps half a mile across at its widest point, but undeniably beautiful. Worth every blister, Will declared, already shrugging off his pack. We established camp on a relatively flat section of shoreline, each falling into our well-practiced roles. Jackson filtered water while Bennett assembled our portable stove. Will and I erected the tents, strategically positioning them to shield against the wind that would inevitably sweep down from the peaks after nightfall. As darkness descended, we gathered around our small cookstove, passing a flask of whiskey while our freeze-dried meals rehydrated. The conversation flowed easily, covering the mundane details of our respective lives that we'd missed in the months since our last gathering. Jackson described his ongoing divorce proceedings with surprising detachment. Will shared anecdotes from his surgical residency. Bennett remained characteristically reserved about his government cybersecurity work. Though he did mention an upcoming international assignment, I contributed little, finding myself increasingly distracted by our surroundings. As night solidified around us, the wilderness seemed to compress, drawing closer. The vastness that had been so evident during daylight hours somehow constricted in the darkness, as though the mountains were slowly bending toward us. Earth to daydreamer. Will snapped his fingers near my face. You planning to actually eat that food you've been stirring for the last 5 minutes? I forced a laugh, attributing my distraction to altitude fatigue. But as we eventually retreated to our tents, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, not by anything human, but by the landscape itself, ancient and indifferent to our presence. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds that echoed across the lake, the crack of distant branches, the hollow call of night birds, and occasionally, something that resembled footsteps circling our campsite, though none of us would acknowledge this last observation until much later. Dawn arrived with merciful brightness, dispelling the unsettling impressions of the night. We emerged from our tents to find the lake shrouded in a thin layer of mist that would burn away within the hour. After a breakfast of instant coffee and protein bars, we decided to attempt one of the nearby peaks, a nameless summit that rose approximately 10,500 feet above sea level. Proper acclimation would mean waiting another day, Bennett reminded us, always the voice of caution. Since when have we done anything properly? Jackson countered, already repacking his day pack with water and emergency supplies. We left our campsite intact, marking our location on GPS before beginning the ascent. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as we climbed, transitioning from forest to alpine meadow to exposed rock face. Conversation waned as we conserved energy, the thinning air demanding greater effort for even basic exertion. By midday, we'd reached what appeared to be the summit, a relatively flat plateau offering panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. The vastness was humbling. From this elevation, we could see the curvature of the earth, mountains rolling toward the horizon like frozen waves. Worth the oxygen deprivation, Will gasped, dropping onto a sun-warmed boulder. We scattered across the plateau, each finding our own space to absorb the magnitude of the landscape. I'd wandered perhaps 50 yards from the others when I heard Bennett call out, "Guys, come look at this." Something in his tone, a strain of uncertainty I'd rarely heard from him, immediately set me on edge. I jogged toward his voice, joining Jackson and Will as they converged on Bennett's position near the eastern edge of the plateau. He stood motionless, staring downward. Following his gaze, I saw it, a horse skull, bleached bone-white by sun and weather, resting amidst a scatter of loose stones. "Trail riders don't come this high," Jackson said, voicing what we were all thinking. Bennett crouched beside the skull, careful not to touch it. No other bones, just the head. The skull's empty eye sockets seemed to watch us as we circled it, maintaining an instinctive distance. The bone was completely clean. No tissue remained, no scent of decay. Nature's cleaning process is thorough but slow. This skull had been exposed to the elements for months, possibly years. Maybe a mountain lion dragged it up here? Will suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Jackson shook his head. Predators don't typically separate skulls so cleanly from the rest of the skeleton, and they certainly don't carry heavy bones to higher elevations. I removed my phone, snapping several photos of the skull from different angles. Bizarre souvenir of the trip, I said, attempting to lighten the mood, though the hollow feeling in my stomach suggested I'd failed even to convince myself. Someone brought it here, Bennett concluded, his expression unreadable. Deliberately. The implication hung between us that we might not be as alone in this supposedly remote wilderness as we'd believed. The vast openness of the plateau suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Let's head back down, I suggested, and no one argued. As we descended, I found myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, scanning the landscape for movement. The majesty of the mountain had somehow transformed in the hour since our discovery. What had seemed awe-inspiring now felt vaguely threatening, as though the wilderness itself had revealed an aspect we hadn't previously perceived. We returned to camp in near silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. The lake that had seemed so inviting the previous evening now appeared opaque, concealing unknown depths. The surrounding forest, which had provided comfortable shelter, now suggested countless hiding places. "You're all being ridiculous," Will finally declared as we slumped around our unlit cook stove. "It's just a skull. Probably been there for years." "Probably," Bennett agreed, though without conviction. But the discovery had altered something fundamental in our perception, introducing an element of human interference where we'd expected only natural processes. Someone had brought that skull to the summit, someone strong enough to carry it up the same punishing terrain we'd just navigated, and with motivation we couldn't begin to comprehend. That evening, we found ourselves huddling closer together than usual, our conversation subdued and frequently interrupted by extended silences, during which we all seemed to be listening intently to the surrounding wilderness. By the following morning, the unease spawned by our discovery had partially subsided, replaced by the more immediate discomforts of wilderness living, specifically, the layer of dried sweat and grime that coated our skin after 2 days without washing. "I can smell each of you individually," Will complained over another breakfast of instant coffee and protein bars. "I'm distinguishing unique bouquets at this point." "Like you're any better," Jackson retorted, throwing a pine cone that bounced harmlessly off Will's shoulder. The lake beckoned with its clear, cold water. Despite the residual discomfort from yesterday's discovery, the prospect of washing away days of accumulated filth proved irresistible. "We should spread out along the shore," Bennett suggested, practical as always. "Give each other some privacy." We gathered our biodegradable soap and clean clothing, then dispersed along the lakeshore. The shoreline's irregular shape, punctuated by small ridges and clusters of trees, provided natural partitions. I selected a spot approximately 200 yards from our campsite, where a gentle slope of smooth stones provided easy access to deeper water. The air temperature hovered in the mid-70s, warm by mountain standards, but the lake water retained the numbing cold of snowmelt. I removed my boots and socks first, allowing my feet to acclimate to the temperature before committing to full immersion. The water clarity was remarkable. I could see every detail of the lake bed, watching small fish dart between submerged rocks. I'd removed my shirt and was unfastening my belt when I heard it, Jackson's voice, distant but clear, calling for us to come quickly. Something in his tone triggered an immediate response. I abandoned my washing plans, hastily grabbing my shirt and boots without putting them on. The lakeshore was uneven, forcing me to pick my path carefully over slippery rocks and through dense undergrowth. I followed the sound of voices, eventually climbing a small ridge that separated my chosen washing spot from what appeared to be a secluded cove. As I crested the ridge, I saw them, Jackson, Will, and Bennett, standing in a loose semicircle facing away from me. They were unnaturally still, like figures in a tableau. Will wore only his hiking shorts, his bare torso pale against the darker background of pine trees. Bennett was fully dressed but missing one boot. Jackson stood slightly apart, his hand raised to his mouth in what appeared to be a gesture of shock or revulsion. I called out as I approached, but none of them responded or turned. It wasn't until I drew alongside them that I understood their stillness, understood what had transfixed them so completely. Before us, partially submerged in the shallow water of the cove, lay the carcass of a horse. The animal was massive, a draft horse perhaps, with a coat that might once have been chestnut but was now mottled with decay and water damage. Its legs extended rigidly, and its bloated body had been dragged partially onto the shore, revealing the horror that had silenced my friends. The horse had no head. The separation wasn't ragged or torn. There was a precision to it that suggested deliberate removal rather than predator activity. The neck ended in a clean line just below where the skull would have connected. "Jesus," Will whispered, then immediately corrected himself. God almighty. None of us moved closer. The carcass showed signs of having been in the water for some time, perhaps a week or more based on the state of decomposition. But not long enough to account for the completely clean, dry skull we'd found on the mountain peak. Could be a coincidence, Bennett said without conviction. Different horses. Jackson shook his head slowly. What are the odds of finding two separate dead horses in the same remote area? One missing its head, the other just a skull. Will took an unsteady step backward. This isn't right. We need to report this to rangers. We're 18 miles from the nearest marked trail, I reminded him. At least a full day's hike to reach a ranger station. A heavy silence descended as we absorbed the implications of our situation, isolated, in remote backcountry with evidence of something disturbing and inexplicable. Bennett was the first to recover his composure. We should document this before deciding our next move. The suggestion was rational, appealing to our need for concrete action in the face of something we couldn't immediately comprehend. Jackson retrieved his phone from his pocket, moving closer to take photographs of the headless carcass from multiple angles. I found myself scanning our surroundings, suddenly hyper-aware of the dense forest that pressed close to the lakeshore, the wilderness that had seemed so pristine, so empty of human interference, now felt watchful, as though we had stumbled into someone's private domain, a place where rules and understandings different from our own prevailed. Will voiced what we were all thinking. Someone did this, recently. And with that simple statement, the wilderness transformed around us. No longer a neutral landscape of rock and water and living things, it became a potential hiding place for someone, or something, capable of deliberate cruelty on a scale none of us had encountered before. While Jackson documented the headless horse with his camera phone, Will paced restlessly along the shoreline. Whether from nervous energy or a need to establish a perimeter, I couldn't be sure. Bennett crouched near the water's edge, examining the ground with the methodical attention he brought to everything. Tracks here, he announced, gesturing toward a section of muddy shoreline. Human boots, fairly recent, size 11 or 12. We gathered around the impressions, distinct treads pressed into the soft earth, partially filled with water but still clearly defined. The implication was unavoidable. Someone had been here, likely within the past day or two given the clarity of the prints despite recent rainfall. Could be another hiker, I suggested without conviction, who happened upon a headless horse carcass and decided not to report it. Jackson countered. Will had continued his shoreline inspection, moving several yards away toward a cluster of partially submerged rocks. "Guys," he called, his voice tight with tension. "There's something else." We joined him, following his gaze to what initially appeared to be debris caught among the rocks, thin brown strips that rippled gently in the water's movement. But as Bennett leaned closer, his breath caught audibly. "That's film," he said, reaching carefully to extract one of the strips from the water. Photographic negatives. The realization struck us simultaneously. Not digital photography from a modern device, but analog film, deliberately developed and then discarded or lost at this remote location. Bennett held the strip up to the sunlight, and we gathered close, momentarily forgetting the headless carcass behind us. The negatives revealed a series of images in reverse exposure, white where there should be black, dark where there should be light. But even with this inversion, the subject was unmistakable. "It's the horse," Jackson whispered, before decomposition set in. The negative showed the same animal we'd discovered, positioned similarly along the shoreline but in a significantly fresher state. And like our discovery, the horse in the photograph was headless, the neck ending in the same clean, deliberate line. Will scrambled to gather more film strips from among the rocks, his earlier caution forgotten in the rush to piece together this macabre puzzle. Each strip contained similar images, the headless horse photographed from various angles, with meticulous attention to detail. "These weren't taken for documentation," Bennett observed, his voice clinical but with an underlying tremor. "This is aesthetic, composed." He was right. The photographs weren't hasty snapshots but carefully framed images, the work of someone who had arranged their subject, considered lighting and composition, and captured the scene with artistic intent. "Who carries analog film equipment into the backcountry?" I asked, though the question was largely rhetorical. In an age of digital convenience, the deliberate choice of film seemed significant, anachronistic and somehow more disturbing for its methodical requirements. Film photography demanded patience. Development required chemicals, darkness, precise timing. Whoever had created these images had either transported, developed negatives back into the wilderness or, more unsettlingly, had the means to develop film here in the backcountry. "The negatives haven't been here long," Bennett noted, examining the condition of the film. "No significant water damage or decomposition of the emulsion. Days at most, not weeks." Jackson, who had moved slightly away from our group, suddenly dropped into a crouch, pointing toward a section of pebbled beach. "Look at this." The film wasn't washed up, it was weighted down. We joined him, observing how several larger stones had been deliberately placed atop film strips, presumably to prevent them from washing away. This wasn't accidental debris, but intentional placement. Recent enough that whoever left these might still be in the area. Will verbalized our collective thought, his gaze sweeping the surrounding forest with new wariness. The implications assembled themselves with terrible clarity. Someone had killed a horse, removed its head with surgical precision, photographed the result using anachronistic technology, developed the images, and then returned to the scene days later to place the negatives near the decaying carcass, all in wilderness so remote, we'd believed ourselves utterly alone. Bennett carefully collected the film strips, placing them in a waterproof pocket of his hiking pants. None of us questioned his actions. Documentation seemed essential, though for what purpose, evidence, protection, understanding remained unclear. As we stepped back from the water's edge, the forest around us seemed to contract, the spaces between trees suddenly pregnant with potential concealment. The vastness that had earlier provided a sense of freedom now emphasized our isolation. Miles from assistance, surrounded by countless hiding places, in territory familiar to someone who clearly operated by logic we couldn't comprehend. "We need to leave," Will stated flatly. "Now." No one disagreed. Returning to camp took on the quality of a tactical operation. Though we'd seen no direct evidence of human presence beyond the boot prints and film negatives, our awareness had fundamentally shifted. The wilderness was no longer empty. It contained someone whose actions suggested a disturbing detachment from normal behavioral constraints. "We'll pack efficiently. Essential items only," Bennett directed as we reached our tents. "Be ready to move in 15 minutes. No one questioned his authority in this moment. Bennett's military background, usually manifested only in his methodical approach to outdoor preparation, now emerged more fully in his capacity for crisis management. As we packed, I found myself repeatedly scanning our surroundings, flinching at ordinary wilderness sounds, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of birds. Every shadow between trees suggested potential observation. "What about reporting this?" Jackson asked, stuffing his sleeping bag with uncharacteristic carelessness. "Rangers should know there's someone out here, doing whatever this is." "We'll report it once we're safely out," Bennett replied, not pausing in his efficient packing. "First priority is distance." Will had been unusually quiet since our discovery, his normally animated features drawn into an expression of concentrated focus. "Whoever did this knows the terrain better than we do," he observed. They've been methodical, planned, not impulsive. The assessment was unsettling precisely because it rang true. The skull placement at high elevation, the precision of the decapitation, the deliberate photography and return to the scene, all suggested calculated actions rather than random violence. Which means they might have monitored typical approach routes, Bennett agreed. We should avoid retracing our entry path. This proposition added complications. Our original route had been selected for navigability. Alternative paths would likely involve more challenging terrain, but none of us argued against the strategic logic. Within 20 minutes, we had dismantled our camp, leaving minimal evidence of our presence. Bennett consulted his topographical map, tracing a finger along a potential exit route that would take us southeast rather than returning west along our entry path. Steeper descent here, he indicated, but it connects to a game trail that should eventually join the marked path about 5 miles further south than where we entered. Under different circumstances, we might have debated the merits of various routes, weighing difficulty against efficiency. Now we simply nodded, shouldering our hastily packed bags without complaint. As we prepared to depart, a final unsettling observation struck me. Our campsite, selected for its relatively flat, comfortable terrain, offered excellent visibility of the surrounding area, yet simultaneously made us easily observable from multiple vantage points in the surrounding heights. We had prioritized comfort over security, never considering that such calculations might be necessary in this remote location. We moved out in tight formation, with Bennett taking point and Jackson covering our rear. The heightened vigilance transformed what would normally have been an enjoyable, if challenging, hike into something that more closely resembled an extraction under potential threat. The terrain proved even more difficult than anticipated. The southeastern approach from the lake involved navigating a steep scree slope, where loose rock shifted treacherously underfoot. We descended in silence, broken only by the occasional warning about unstable footing or low-hanging branches. Approximately 2 hours into our retreat, we reached a narrow ravine where the path, little more than a game trail at this point, forced us into single file. Rock walls rose sharply on either side, creating a natural bottleneck. I noticed Bennett's hesitation as we approached. "I don't like this," he muttered, scanning the ridgeline above. "Too constricted." But the alternatives involved significantly longer routes or impossibly steep terrain. After a brief pause to assess, we proceeded through the ravine, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The tension peaked as we navigated this constricted passage. Every falling pebble, every brush of fabric against stone, seemed magnified in the enclosed space. The ravine extended for perhaps a quarter mile before gradually widening, our collective relief almost palpable as the walls receded. We had covered approximately 7 miles from our original campsite when Bennett called our first substantial break. We collapsed onto fallen logs and rocks, gulping water and reassessing our position. According to the map, we had another 11 miles before reaching the marked trail where we might encounter other hikers. We should be able to make at least another 6 miles before nightfall, Bennett calculated, studying the angle of the sun. The prospect of darkness was something none of us had directly addressed. The necessity of spending another night in the backcountry hung between us, unspoken but unavoidable. If we push hard, could we make it all the way out before dark? Will asked, voicing our collective preference. Bennett shook his head. Not safely. The terrain gets more technical ahead, and attempting it in failing light would be risking injury. The logic was sound but unsatisfying. Another night in the wilderness with its newfound potential threats stretched before us like a dark promise. We rested only briefly before continuing our descent, each of us privately calculating the distance between our current position and safety, between exposure and shelter, between isolation and the protective presence of others. As afternoon transitioned toward evening, the forest grew denser, the light filtering through the canopy in increasingly oblique patterns. Shadows lengthened, creating pockets of premature darkness among the trees. Every darkened recess seemed to contain potential observation. We need to select a defensible position before full darkness, Bennett eventually stated, verbalizing the security concerns we all, fair to the term defensible, so out of place in what should have been simply a recreational activity, underscored how profoundly our wilderness experience had transformed. in the hours since discovering the headless horse and its photographers' calling card. We established our emergency camp on a small plateau backed against a cliff face, providing security from one direction at least. Bennett directed us to construct a minimal camp. No fire, cold rations only. Tents pitched close together rather than spread for privacy. We'll establish a watch rotation, he decided, using a tone that invited no debate. 2-hour shifts, 2 people per shift. No one alone. The arrangement meant reduced sleep for all of us. But the alternative, unwatched vulnerability throughout the night, was unthinkable after what we'd discovered. As darkness descended completely, sounds that would have been merely atmospheric the previous night now carried potential significance. The crack of branches underfoot could be nocturnal animals or human movement. Wind through pine boughs could mask deliberate approach. Even the calls of night birds seemed to contain patterns that suggested communication rather than natural behavior. Will and I took the first watch, positioning ourselves at opposite edges of our small camp, creating a perimeter of awareness while Bennett and Jackson attempted to rest. "This is insane," Will whispered after nearly 30 minutes of tense silence. "We're letting horse parts and some weird photography hobby drive us into paranoia." The rational assessment did nothing to dispel the visceral unease that had settled into our collective consciousness. Something fundamental had been violated, not just the horse, whose mutilation was disturbing enough, but our understanding of wilderness itself. The backcountry was supposed to be challenging but fundamentally comprehensible. What we'd encountered operated outside those understandings. "It's not just the horse," I replied, keeping my voice low. "It's the deliberateness of it all. The staging. The return to place the negatives." Will nodded slowly. "The ritual aspect." That was it precisely. The sense of witnessing evidence of some private ceremony or practice, governed by logic we couldn't access. The horse skull placed at high elevation, the headless body positioned along the shoreline, the carefully composed photographs, the deliberate placement of negatives near the decomposing subject. Each element suggested meaning rather than randomness. Our watch passed without incident, and we woke Bennett and Jackson for the second shift. I crawled into my tent, fully clothed including boots, with my pack positioned for immediate grabbing. Sleep seemed impossible under the circumstances, yet exhaustion eventually overcame hypervigilance. I awakened to Bennett's hand on my shoulder, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay absolutely quiet. Listen." Instantly alert, I strained to identify what had prompted his warning. At first, I heard only the ambient sounds of the wilderness at night, then distinguished it. Rhythmic movement through underbrush, approximately 50 yards from our position. Not the random patterns of wildlife, but the deliberate progression of something large moving with purpose. Jackson spotted a light, Bennett whispered close to my ear. Brief flash, like someone using a red-filtered headlamp, coming from the ridge above. We remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe as the sounds continued. Measured footsteps moving parallel to our position, neither approaching nor retreating but maintaining a consistent distance. Occasionally branches would crack underfoot, followed by prolonged silence as though the source had paused to listen or observe. This continued for approximately 20 minutes, the presence neither revealing itself fully nor departing, but establishing what felt intentionally like awareness of our location without direct confrontation. Eventually, the sounds receded, moving gradually eastward until they faded entirely. We remained frozen in position for what seemed an eternity, none of us willing to break the silence that might reveal our exact location. "Could have been an animal," Will finally suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Bennett shook his head slightly. "Red light filter. Someone's out there." The remainder of the night passed in hypervigilant rotation, our watch shifts reduced to 1 hour to combat fatigue. None of us achieved meaningful rest. By the time first light filtered through the trees, we were already packed and prepared to move, eager to escape the oppressive sense of being monitored from just beyond our perceptual boundaries. Our descent resumed with renewed urgency. The physical discomforts of rapid hiking through challenging terrain, blisters, muscle fatigue, minor scrapes from branches, registered as inconsequential compared to the psychological burden of potential observation. We encountered the first sign of regular human presence, a clearly maintained trail marker shortly after noon. The simple wooden sign, weathered but official, prompted an almost embarrassing surge of relief. We had reached the edge of true isolation, entering terrain where others reliably passed. 8 more miles to the trailhead, Bennett calculated, consulting his map. We covered that distance with a steady determination born of collective urgency, encountering a handful of day hikers moving in the opposite direction. Their casual greetings and ordinary equipment, water bottles rather than filtration systems, light day packs instead of expedition gear, emphasized our transition back toward normal human patterns. We reached Bennett's SUV by late afternoon, collapsing against it with the exhausted relief of soldiers returning from combat. The ordinary objects in the vehicle, spare clothing, forgotten snack wrappers, a forgotten paperback on the back seat, seemed artifacts from a different reality, one governed by comprehensible patterns and predictable causality. Ranger station? Jackson suggested as we loaded our gear. Bennett nodded, starting the engine. We report this. All of it. The ranger's expression shifted from professional courtesy to focused concern as our account progressed. Initially, she seemed to categorize us as typical hikers reporting ordinary wildlife observations. But as Bennett methodically described our discoveries, the horse skull at elevation, the headless carcass by the lake, the carefully placed photographic negatives, her demeanor transformed. You have the negatives? She asked, her tone carefully neutral. Bennett produced the sealed plastic bag containing the film strips we'd collected. The ranger accepted it without touching the contents directly, instead placing it inside an evidence envelope. And approximate GPS coordinates for both locations? We provided the data from our devices, watching as she marked positions on a large topographical map of the park's backcountry. I noticed her adding our discovery to other markers already present on the map, small red pins clustered in several remote areas. We're not the first to report something like this, are we? Will observed. The ranger's hesitation was brief but telling. We've had reports of unusual findings in the backcountry. Nothing conclusively connected. But similar enough that you're tracking them, Bennett pressed. She studied us for a moment, apparently assessing how much information to share with civilians. There have been several reports over the past 3 years of animal remains positioned in what appear to be deliberate arrangements, primarily in very remote areas, primarily discovered by experienced backcountry users like yourselves. And the photography aspect? I asked. Another hesitation. You're the third group to report finding photographic documentation near displays. First with negatives, though. Previous reports involved Polaroid photographs. The information sent a chill through me despite the ranger station's comfortable warmth. Not isolated incidents then, but a pattern, evolving but consistent in its fundamental aspects. Do you have any suspects? Jackson asked. The ranger closed her notebook with deliberate care. I can't discuss ongoing investigations, but I can tell you we're taking this very seriously. Your report is valuable, particularly the detail about movement near your camp during the night. We provided contact information and formal statements, a process that occupied several hours. By the time we departed the ranger station, darkness had fallen again, though this time punctuated by the reassuring artificial lights of civilization. That should have been the conclusion, a disturbing wilderness encounter, properly reported to authorities, relegated to anecdote status. But 7 years later, I find the experience has not receded but rather has periodically resurfaced with unexpected clarity. I still hike, though never again in Yellowstone's backcountry. My annual trips with Jackson, Will, and Bennett continued for several years afterward, though with subtle adjustments, preferences for popular, well-traveled routes, avoidance of truly remote locations, a collective, unspoken gravitation toward trails where regular ranger patrols were known to operate. Eventually, our group expeditions tapered as life intervened. Bennett accepted an overseas assignment. Will's surgical practice demanded increasing time. Jackson relocated to the Pacific Northwest after finalizing his divorce. We maintained contact through sporadic video calls and occasional one-on-one visits. But our collective wilderness adventures have become archival rather than ongoing. I followed news reports about Yellowstone for years afterward, searching for any mention of unusual discoveries or arrests related to what we'd encountered. Nothing conclusive ever emerged publicly. Occasional vague references to vandalism or wildlife harassment in extremely remote areas suggested continued activity, but details remained sparse. 3 years after our experience, I received an unexpected email from the ranger who had taken our report. She offered no specifics, but did mention that our information had contributed significantly to an ongoing federal investigation. She thanked us for our detailed observations and advised that we might be contacted by federal authorities, though such contact never materialized. Sometimes during otherwise ordinary moments, standing in line at a grocery store, sitting in traffic, attending a workplace meeting, I am suddenly overtaken by the memory of those negatives held up against mountain sunlight, revealing their inverted images of deliberate mutilation, or I recall the measured footsteps circling our camp in darkness, the brief flash of filtered red light among distant trees. In these moments, I'm reminded that wilderness represents more than geographical remoteness. It can also describe psychological territory, spaces beyond normal constraints, where actions that would be immediately identified and contained in civilization can unfold according to private logic, visible only through their careful documentation. I've come to believe that what we encountered was neither supernatural nor particularly mysterious in itself. Rather, we glimpsed evidence of human behavior operating beyond social boundaries, in terrain where oversight is minimal and private ritual can develop uninterrupted. The wilderness amplified this encounter not through any inherent quality, but through the stark contrast it provided: beauty against cruelty, vastness against intimate detail, natural processes against deliberate interference. The national parks brochures warn visitors about bears, unpredictable weather, and treacherous terrain. They suggest proper equipment, adequate water, and appropriate emergency preparations. They never mention the possibility of encountering evidence that the human capacity for disturbing behavior extends even into supposedly pristine wilderness, that someone might be watching from beyond the firelight, documenting their private ceremonies and occasionally allowing others glimpses of practices governed by impenetrable personal mythology. Our hiking group's unspoken motto had always been that the scariest thing in the wilderness was the occasional uncomfortable outdoor bathroom situation. We were wrong. The truly frightening element was what we brought with us: human consciousness with its capacity for both transcendent appreciation and unfathomable cruelty, existing simultaneously in the same magnificent landscape. I've always loved the outdoors. By the time I was 10 years old, my family had established a tradition of regular camping trips that punctuated our years with adventures in nature. My parents, Robert and Julia, believed strongly in exposing my older sister, Catherine, my baby brother, David, and me to natural environments away from the glow of screens and the constant hum of suburban life. Our camping experiences had always been positive, educational, bonding opportunities where we pitched tents under star-filled skies, learned to build fires, identify plants, and respect wildlife. These trips formed some of my most cherished childhood memories: the taste of slightly burnt marshmallows, the comforting sound of my father's deep laugh echoing across a lake, my mother's patient instruction as she taught us to identify constellations. But memories aren't always kind. Sometimes they're stained with fear, marked by moments when childhood innocence confronts the darker realities of the world. This is the story of one such memory: a weekend in the Poconos Mountains of Pennsylvania that permanently altered my perception of safety and human nature. It was early June of 2008. School had just let out for summer break, and our parents had surprised us with news of a 3-day weekend at a campground in the Poconos. Unlike our usual trips where we pitched tents and roughed it, this time they had rented a small cabin at Pine Grove Campground, a sprawling property featuring dozens of wooden structures scattered around a central recreation area. "It'll be more comfortable," my mother had explained while packing our bags, "and there are more facilities for you kids." At the time, I was just excited about the change of scenery and the promise of new adventures. I couldn't have known that amidst the beauty of those mountains lurked a danger no parent can fully protect against, and no child should ever have to face. The drive to the Poconos took just over 3 hours from our home in New Jersey, I remember pressing my face against the car window as we wound through increasingly densely forested roads, watching as civilization gradually gave way to wilderness. Catherine, then 13, spent most of the journey with headphones firmly planted over her ears, while 2-year-old David alternated between napping and demanding attention from anyone who would give it. Pine Grove Campground announced itself with a weathered wooden sign, the paint peeling slightly at the edges, a detail that in retrospect seems ominous but at the time merely registered as rustic charm. The gravel road leading into the property was flanked by tall pines that seemed to watch our progress, their shadows dancing across our car as we passed beneath them. The main office was a log cabin structure with a wide porch. While our parents checked in, Catherine, David, and I explored the small gift shop attached to the office. It sold the usual camping supplies, snacks, and souvenirs. I remember a rotating rack of postcards showing idyllic scenes of the Poconos, sunrise over mountain lakes, deer drinking from crystal streams, families smiling around campfires. None showed the reality I would soon experience. The campground manager, an older man with weathered skin and calloused hands named Mr. Gregory, handed my father a map of the property and the keys to cabin 17. He seemed friendly enough, pointing out the recreation areas, shower facilities, and hiking trails. "You picked a good weekend," he told my parents as we prepared to head to our cabin. "Not too crowded. You folks should have plenty of peace and quiet." The way he emphasized peace and quiet struck me as strange even then, almost like a warning. Our cabin was nestled in a semicircle of similar structures, all facing a large clearing. The buildings were simple but well-maintained, single-room affairs with bunk beds, a small table, chairs, and a kitchenette. No bathroom. Those facilities were communal and located a short walk away. The cabin smelled of pine and the faint mustiness that accompanies infrequently used spaces. As we unpacked, I noted the other cabins around us. Most seemed empty, with only 2 showing signs of occupation, lights in the windows, a cooler on a porch. The isolation should have been the first warning sign, but at 10 years old such concerns weren't part of my worldview. After settling in, my mother prepared a simple lunch of sandwiches, chips, and fruit. The adults discussed plans for the weekend, hiking tomorrow, possibly fishing in the afternoon, maybe a campfire with s'mores in the evening. Mundane details of a family vacation that would soon be overshadowed by events none of us could have anticipated. After lunch, restlessness set in. Catherine had brought a novel and sprawled across the top bunk, immediately lost in fictional worlds. David needed a nap, which meant my mother needed quiet in the cabin. My father had engaged in conversation with another camper he'd met outside, discussing fishing spots and the weather forecast. I was left to my own devices, a situation I usually welcomed. I had packed my favorite baseball equipment, an aluminum bat my grandfather had given me for my birthday, and a small collection of baseballs. Baseball had been my passion that summer. I joined Little League and spent countless hours practicing my swing in our backyard. "I'm going to practice hitting," I announced, grabbing my gear. My mother looked up from where she was trying to settle David. "Stay where we can see you. And don't go too far from the cabin." "I won't," I promised, already halfway out the door. The clearing in front of our cabin formed a natural practice area. The grass was trimmed low, and there were no obstacles or windows within range of my hitting. Perfect for a few practice swings, I positioned myself in what I judged to be the center of the clearing, tossed a ball into the air and swung. The satisfying crack of aluminum against leather echoed across the clearing. I watched with pride as the ball soared and then descended in a graceful arc, landing near the edge of the woods. I jogged to retrieve it, noticing as I did how quiet the campground was. No distant voices, no music from other cabins, not even much bird song, just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. For about 10 minutes, I repeated this process: toss, swing, retrieve. Each hit sent a jolt of satisfaction through my arms. I was improving. I could tell by how the ball traveled farther with each swing. Lost in the rhythm of practice, I initially didn't notice the sound of an approaching vehicle. The crunch of tires on gravel eventually broke through my concentration. I turned to see a dark green sedan rolling slowly down the access road that wound between the cabins. There was nothing inherently unusual about a car in a campground. but something about this one immediately set off warning signals in my mind. Perhaps it was the speed, too slow, like the driver was searching for something. Or maybe it was the condition of the vehicle. Not the typical outdoor enthusiast car, but an older model sedan with visible rust spots and a cracked windshield. The car came to a stop about 20 feet behind where I stood, its engine idling with a rough, unhealthy sound. I clutched my bat tighter, suddenly aware of how alone I was in the clearing. The cabins seemed farther away, my father's voice more distant as he continued his conversation, oblivious to what was unfolding. The car sat idling for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. I remained frozen in place, bat gripped in sweaty hands, instinctively sensing that something wasn't right. Then with a mechanical whir, the driver's side window began to lower. The man behind the wheel was probably in his 40s, though as a child, I wasn't good at judging adult ages. What I remember most vividly was his smile. Not a genuine expression of friendliness, but something manufactured, like he had studied how normal people smile and was attempting a poor imitation. His teeth were slightly yellowed, and one upper incisor was obviously chipped. "Hey there, sport," he called, his voice pitched in that artificial way adults sometimes use when talking to children they don't know. "That's some good hitting." I mumbled a thank you, taking an almost imperceptible step backward. Up close, I could see inside his car, and what I saw intensified my discomfort. The passenger seat and footwell were littered with fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, and what looked like old newspapers. A strange odor wafted from the open window, a combination of cigarette smoke, old food, and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach tighten. "You know, you're not supposed to play baseball here," he said, maintaining that unnerving smile. I frowned, confused. There had been no signs prohibiting sports in the clearing, and the campground manager hadn't mentioned any such restrictions when we checked in. "I didn't know that," I replied cautiously. The man's smile widened slightly. "Yeah, it's because of insurance. Campground doesn't want to get sued if someone gets hit by a ball." He paused, then continued with a note of false enthusiasm. "But there's a real nice baseball field just up on that hill over there. Proper backstop and everything." He gestured toward a densely wooded hill that rose behind the cabins. I'd seen nothing resembling a baseball field during our arrival, and there had been no mention of such a facility on the campground map. "I can drive you up there if you want," he continued when I didn't respond. "It's a bit of a hike, but only a minute by car. You'll have a lot more room to practice." He leaned across the passenger seat and pushed the door open. "Hop in, it'll be fun." The way he said fun sent waves of revulsion through me. His eyes didn't match his smile. They remained cold, calculating, assessing my reaction. I tightened my grip on the bat, shifting my stance slightly. Years of watching crime shows with my parents against their better judgment had taught me to recognize danger, and every cell in my body was screaming that this man represented a threat. "No thank you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My dad told me not to go anywhere." The man's expression flickered, the manufactured smile faltering for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Your dad won't mind. We'll be back before he even notices you're gone." I saw his hand move to the door handle, and I took another step backward, raising my bat slightly, not in an overtly threatening manner, but enough to communicate that I wasn't as defenseless as he might have hoped. Just then, the door to our cabin swung open. My father's booming laugh carried across the clearing as he stepped outside, phone pressed to his ear, engaged in conversation with what I later learned was my uncle. The sound was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. The man in the car froze, his eyes darting toward my father. I expected anger, frustration, perhaps a hasty retreat. Instead, what I witnessed was far more disturbing. His expression remained almost unnaturally calm as he looked back at me, and he offered a small nod, as if acknowledging the end of a round in a game that only he knew we were playing. "Another time, sport," he said softly, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Maybe I'll see you around the campground." With that, he closed the passenger door, rolled up his window, and drove away, his car disappearing around a bend in the access road. I stood motionless in the clearing, the baseball bat hanging limply from my trembling hands. My father continued his phone conversation, unaware of what had just transpired mere yards away. Part of me wanted to run to him, to blurt out everything about the strange man and his unsettling invitation. Another part, the part that was beginning to understand the true nature of the danger I'd just encountered, kept me silent. Eventually, I gathered my baseballs and walked back to the cabin on unsteady legs. Inside, my mother had successfully gotten David down for his nap and was quietly organizing our supplies for dinner. Catherine remained absorbed in her book, occasionally turning a page with theatrical significance. "Done practicing already?" my mother asked without looking up from her task. I nodded, unable to form words around the lump in my throat. "You look pale," she observed, finally turning her attention fully to me. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just tired," I lied, placing my bat and balls in the corner of the cabin. "I think I'll rest for a bit." She placed a cool hand against my forehead, checking for fever with the automatic response of mothers everywhere. "Well, you don't feel warm. Maybe you're just hungry. We'll have dinner soon." I climbed onto the lower bunk beneath Catherine and lay down, my mind racing. Should I tell my parents? Would they believe me? Would they make a big deal about it? Possibly ruining the trip for everyone? Or worse, would they dismiss it as my imagination? Perhaps even scold me for making up stories. At 10 years old, these calculations were complex and overwhelming. In the end, fear won out. Not fear of the man, but fear of disrupting the family dynamic, of being seen as a troublemaker or attention seeker. I decided to keep the encounter to myself, but to remain vigilant and stay close to my family for the remainder of the trip. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I went through the motions of helping prepare dinner, playing a card game with Catherine when she finally emerged from her literary cocoon, and listening to my parents discuss plans for the next day's hike. All the while, my eyes constantly drifted to the windows, scanning for any sign of a dark green sedan. As dusk fell, the forest around us transformed. Shadows lengthened and merged, turning familiar shapes into looming threats. Each rustle of leaves became the footsteps of an approaching predator. Each distant car engine morphed into the return of the green sedan. By the time we gathered around the small fire pit outside our cabin for s'mores, I was a bundle of raw nerves. "You're jumpy tonight," my father remarked as I flinched at the sound of a branch breaking in the nearby woods. "Scared of the dark. All of a sudden?" "No," I mumbled, edging closer to him on the log we shared. "Just thought I heard something." He chuckled and ruffled my hair. "Probably just a raccoon or deer. Nothing to worry about out here." But I knew better. The threat, lurking in these woods, walked on two legs, drove a green sedan, and had eyes that remained cold even when his mouth smiled. Sleep eluded me that night. In the small cabin, with my family's breathing forming a chorus of familiar sounds, I should have felt safe. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the wooden slats of Catherine's bunk above me, my ears straining for any unusual noise outside. Every creak of the cabin structure, every whisper of wind through the pine needles, every distant animal call sent fresh waves of adrenaline surging through my body. I imagined the man from the green car creeping around our cabin, testing. Windows peering through cracks in the blinds with those cold, calculating eyes. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching. My heart nearly stopped as the headlights swept across our cabin window, briefly illuminating the interior with ghostly light. I held my breath, muscles tense to the point of pain, as the car slowed near our cabin. Please keep going, I silently pleaded. After what seemed an eternity, the vehicle continued past, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. Whether it was simply another camper returning late or something more sinister, I'll never know. What matters is the fear, raw and all-consuming, that kept me rigid in my bunk until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. When morning finally came, I must have looked as exhausted as I felt. My mother commented on the dark, circles under my eyes as she prepared breakfast on the small camp stove outside our cabin. "Did you not sleep well?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. I shrugged. The bunk was uncomfortable. It was easier than explaining the truth, that I'd spent the night certain a predator was lurking just beyond the thin wooden walls of our cabin. waiting for an opportunity that thankfully never came. Breakfast was a subdued affair for me, though the rest of the family buzzed with excitement about the day's planned activities. My father had mapped out a hiking trail that promised spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. Under normal circumstances, I would have been thrilled. Now, the thought of venturing deeper into the woods sent tendrils of dread coiling through my stomach. As we prepared for the hike, I made sure to stay within arm's reach of my parents at all times. David was secured in a carrier on my father's back, and Catherine walked slightly ahead, her newfound teenage independence asserting itself in the small ways available at a family outing. Throughout the hike, my head swiveled constantly, scanning the trail ahead and behind for any sign of danger. Each hiker we passed received my intense scrutiny, my body tensing until they were well past us. My mother noticed, of course. Mothers always do. "You're not usually this jumpy on hikes," she observed as I practically leapt out of my skin when a squirrel darted across our path. "Is something bothering you?" I mumbled something about not sleeping well and kept walking, my eyes constantly sweeping the surroundings. The beautiful mountain scenery, which should have been a source of wonder and joy, became in my mind a perfect setting for an ambush. Too many places to hide, too few people to witness. The hike mercifully concluded without incident, and we returned to the campground by mid-afternoon. As our cabin came into view, I scanned the parking area and surrounding roads for any sign of a dark green sedan. Seeing none, I felt the first marginal relaxation of muscles that had been tensed for nearly 24 hours. Our last full day at Pine Grove passed in a similar fashion, me maintaining constant vigilance while trying not to alert my family to my state of terror. We went fishing at a small lake within the campground boundaries, and while Catherine and my father focused on their lines, I focused on the access road visible through the trees, watching for any approaching vehicles. By afternoon, my exhaustion had reached a critical point. The combination of a sleepless night and the constant state of high alert had drained me completely. When we returned to the cabin for a late lunch, I collapsed onto my bunk and, despite my best intentions to remain watchful, fell into a deep sleep. I awoke to the sound of my mother preparing dinner. Disoriented, I sat up quickly, panic flooding through me as I realized I'd let my guard down. "There he is," my father commented with a smile. "We thought you might sleep through dinner." "How long was I asleep?" I asked, voice hoarse with anxiety. "About 3 hours," my mother replied. "You must have been exhausted." 3 hours. 3 hours during which anything could have happened. 3 hours when the man in the green car could have returned, could have been watching our cabin, noting our routines, making plans. The paranoia that gripped me then might seem excessive in retrospect, but to a 10-year-old who had glimpsed the darker side of human nature, it was entirely reasonable. The world had suddenly revealed itself as a place where danger could wear. A smile and evil could drive a sedan, and nothing would ever feel completely safe again. Our final evening at Pine Grove involved another campfire, more s'mores, and my parents reminiscing about their own childhood camping experiences. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect family moment. Instead, I spent it, with my back pressed firmly against my father's side, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. That night, I again fought a losing battle against sleep, determined to remain vigilant. But exhaustion eventually won out, and I drifted off sometime in the early morning hours, my young body simply unable to sustain the adrenaline levels of the previous days. When I awoke, sunlight was streaming through the cabin windows and the sounds of my family packing for our departure filled the small space. We had survived the weekend. The man in the green car had not returned, or if he had not made his presence known. As we loaded our gear into our car, I took one final look around the campground. In the bright morning light, with other families emerging from their cabins, the place looked harmless, even idyllic. Only I knew the darkness that had lurked beneath its peaceful surface. On the drive home, as we wound back down the mountain roads towards civilization, my father unfolded the campground map to check our route. I leaned forward from the back seat, ostensibly interested in navigation but actually driven by a darker curiosity. "Dad, what's up on that hill behind the cabins?" I asked, pointing to the area where the man had claimed a baseball field existed. My father studied the map. Just some hiking trails and a picnic area near a creek. Why do you ask? The confirmation sent ice through my veins. There was no baseball field, just as I had suspected. The man's invitation had been exactly what I had feared. A lure, a trap for an unsuspecting child. No reason, I replied, sinking back into my seat. Just curious. I never told my parents about the encounter. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps they could have reported it to the campground management or local authorities, potentially preventing the man from approaching other children. That guilt has stayed with me over the years, tempering the relief I feel at my own escape. In the weeks and months that followed our trip to Pine Grove, I developed habits that puzzled my parents. A reluctance to play outside alone, a newfound suspicion of strangers that bordered on rudeness, startling awake from nightmares I refused to discuss. They attributed these changes to the normal growing pains of approaching adolescence. Only I knew their true source. As years passed, the raw terror of those 3 days gradually dulled to a wary caution that has informed my interaction with the world ever since. I became the child who checked the locks twice, who never took shortcuts through isolated areas, who instinctively noted the nearest exits in any room I entered. I've often wondered what became of the man in the green car. Did he find another child, one less cautious or more trusting than I had been? The thought haunts me still. I've also wondered what might have happened had my father not emerged from our cabin at that precise moment. The alternative scenarios that play out in my mind are too horrifying to articulate. Now as an adult, I understand how fortunate I was. I recognize the man for what he was, a predator, methodical and patient, who had likely been watching the campground, waiting for precisely the opportunity I had inadvertently presented. A child alone, away from direct supervision. The experience taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flair. Sometimes it arrives in an unremarkable green sedan, wears a practiced smile, and speaks in carefully modulated tones designed to build false trust. It taught me that instinct, that primal, wordless alarm system we all possess, deserves to be heeded, especially when it concerns our safety. I still enjoy the outdoors and even occasionally go camping, though I've never returned to the Poconos, but I am never truly at ease in isolated natural settings. Part of me is always on alert, always watching, always aware that the boundary between safety and danger is thinner than most people realize. Some childhood lessons are learned through gentle guidance. Others are seared into consciousness through near misses with unimaginable outcomes. Mine was the latter. A crash course in human predation delivered over a weekend in June when I was 10 years old, by a man whose name I never knew, driving a car I still scan for in parking lots 2 decades later. That's the true horror of such encounters. They never fully end. They become part of you, altering your perception of safety in ways that can never be undone. The man in the green car may have driven away that day, but in some sense, he's been following me ever since. A shadow at the edge of memory, a reminder of how quickly childhood innocence can collide with the darkest aspects of humanity. "5 years ago, during the summer of 2020, I found myself planning an escape from the monotony of everyday life. The pandemic had forced most of us into isolation, and I was desperate for an adventure once travel restrictions began to ease. My longtime friends, Jack, David, and William, were equally eager to reconnect with nature after months of confinement. We settled on a 2-week expedition to the boundary waters that stretch between Minnesota and Canada, a vast labyrinth of interconnected lakes that represent the pinnacle of wilderness canoeing. At 28, I considered myself reasonably experienced in outdoor activities. I'd spent many weekends hiking various trails and had completed several shorter camping trips, but nothing quite as ambitious as what we were planning. The boundary waters aren't your typical camping destination. They comprise thousands of pristine lakes spanning over 1 million acres of remote wilderness. The area is so isolated that in many spots you can paddle for days without encountering another human being. Our preparation was extensive. We purchased topographical maps, high-quality camping gear, fishing equipment, and emergency supplies. We invested in a satellite phone, an expense that seemed excessive at the time but would later prove invaluable. The plan was straightforward yet flexible. We would canoe from lake to lake, fish for our meals, and immerse ourselves in the untamed beauty of one of North America's last true wildernesses. We arranged for a helicopter pickup service that would retrieve us whenever we decided our adventure had reached its conclusion. "Remember," David said during our final planning session, "we need to be prepared for anything. Weather changes rapidly up there and help is hours, sometimes days away." None of us fully comprehended the weight of his words at the time. We were too excited about the prospect of disconnecting from society and reconnecting with each other. Our conversations were filled with anticipation about the fishing, the campfire stories, and the stargazing opportunities. We discussed potential routes but ultimately decided against a rigid itinerary. The freedom to explore at our own pace was, after all, part of the appeal. The night before our departure, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet my thoughts. There was excitement, certainly, but also an inexplicable uneasiness that I couldn't quite place. I dismissed it as pre-adventure jitters and forced myself to close my eyes, knowing that the journey ahead would demand my full energy and attention. We arrived at our entry point on a bright Monday morning. The outfitter who dropped us off gave us a final rundown of safety protocols and weather patterns before wishing us luck. As his truck disappeared down the dirt road, leaving behind only a cloud of dust, the four of us stood at the edge of the first lake, taking in the vastness that stretched before us. "This is it," Jack said, adjusting his backpack. "No turning back now." The first few days unfolded exactly as we had hoped. We established a comfortable routine: wake at dawn, break camp, paddle until midday, fish for lunch, continue to our next destination, set up camp, fish for dinner, and end the day with stories around a campfire. The lakes were as spectacular as promised, crystal clear waters reflecting the endless blue sky, surrounded by dense forests of pine and birch. Occasionally we'd spot wildlife, a soaring eagle, a curious otter, or a moose waiting in the shallows. By the fourth day, we had settled into the rhythm of wilderness living. The concerns of everyday life seemed increasingly distant, replaced by more immediate considerations: the weather, our food supply, the next campsite. We documented our journey in a shared journal, taking turns recording the day's events and observations. "I haven't felt this relaxed in years," William remarked one evening as we sat around the campfire, our bellies full of freshly caught walleye. "It's like the outside world doesn't exist anymore." I nodded in agreement, though something about his statement lingered in my mind. The isolation, while rejuvenating, also meant vulnerability. We were entirely dependent on ourselves and each other. If something went wrong, help would not be immediately available. The thought was fleeting, quickly chased away by the camaraderie and the simple pleasures of the moment. We stayed up late that night, watching the northern lights dance across the sky in brilliant shades of green and purple, a natural spectacle that seemed to validate our decision to venture this far from civilization. By the end of the first week, we had covered considerable distance, navigating through a series of smaller lakes connected by narrow channels. The weather had been remarkably cooperative, sunny days with mild temperatures and gentle breezes. That changed on our 8th day. We started the morning with plans to reach Lake Insula, one of the larger bodies of water in the area. The journey would involve several hours of paddling, but we had grown confident in our abilities and were eager to explore new territory. About an hour into our journey, while traversing a long, narrow lake, David noticed a change in the atmosphere. "Look at the horizon," he said, pointing northwest. Dark clouds were gathering in the distance, advancing rapidly in our direction. The wind, which had been a gentle companion, suddenly picked up, creating ripples across the previously calm water surface. "We need to find shelter," Jack urged. "Those clouds don't look friendly." We hastened our paddling, searching for a suitable landing spot along the shoreline. The waves were growing with each passing minute, and our canoes, sturdy as they were, weren't designed to handle rough waters. William pulled out his binoculars and confirmed our fears. "The waves ahead are at least 2 feet high and growing," he reported grimly. "We can't proceed." About 20 minutes later, we spotted a small clearing on the eastern shore. It wasn't ideal. The terrain was rocky and slightly elevated, but it offered better protection than continuing on the increasingly turbulent lake. With coordinated effort, we navigated our canoes toward the clearing. The landing was precarious. The waves pushed against our vessels, threatening to capsize them as we approached the shore. Through careful maneuvering and sheer determination, we managed to beach the canoes and quickly unload our essential gear. "Set up the tents first," I shouted over the howling wind. "We need shelter before everything gets soaked." Working together with practiced efficiency, we erected our tents in record time, securing them with extra stakes to withstand the impending storm. Just as we finished tying down the last tent, the rain began. Not a gentle drizzle, but a sudden downpour that seemed to transform day into night. We retreated into our tents, two to each, listening to the tempest rage outside. Thunder boomed overhead, followed by flashes of lightning that illuminated our shelters in brief, eerie bursts. The wind tested the resilience of our equipment, causing the tent fabric to flap violently. "Well, this is certainly an adventure now," David attempted to joke from the adjacent tent, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Inside my tent, Jack and I laid out our sleeping bags on the ground sheet, creating a barrier against the moisture that had started to seep through the floor despite the tent's waterproof claims. We arranged our packs to form makeshift pillows and settled in for what promised to be a long, uncomfortable night. "Do you think it'll pass by morning?" Jack asked, his usually confident voice tinged with concern. "Let's hope so," I replied, though the intensity of the storm suggested otherwise. "At least we're not out on the water." As night fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The temperature dropped considerably, adding to our discomfort. We huddled in our sleeping bags, trying to conserve warmth. Sleep was practically impossible with the constant bombardment of noise, the rustling of tent fabric, the pounding of rain, the cracking of thunder, and occasionally, the unsettling sound of branches breaking in the surrounding forest. Throughout the night, I drifted in and out of consciousness, awoken repeatedly by particularly loud thunderclaps or when the wind threatened to uproot our temporary shelter. In those moments of wakefulness, strange thoughts crept into my mind. I found myself wondering about other campers in the area, whether they had found adequate shelter or were battling the elements as we were. I thought about the vastness of the wilderness around us, how small and insignificant we were in comparison. Most disturbingly, I found myself contemplating what would happen if the storm didn't pass. If we were stranded here for days, our supplies dwindling, the satellite phone potentially damaged by water. When morning finally arrived, it brought with it a welcome reprieve. The rain had reduced to a light drizzle, and the wind had calmed considerably. Emerging from our tents, we surveyed the aftermath. Our campsite had weathered the storm relatively well, though everything was sodden. The surrounding area bore evidence of the night's fury. Fallen branches, puddles of water, and debris scattered across the ground. "Well, that was something," William said, stretching his stiff limbs. "Everyone okay?" We nodded, relieved to have made it through without major incident. The lake, which had been so threatening the previous day, now appeared almost serene, though the water level had visibly risen. "Let's assess the damage and dry out what we can," I suggested. "Then we can decide on our next move." With the storm behind us and the sun gradually breaking through the clouds, our spirits lifted. We spent the morning drying our equipment and clothes, hanging them on nearby branches to catch the increasing sunlight. Despite the previous night's discomfort, the conversation was optimistic as we discussed our plans for the day. "I'm thinking we skip the long paddle for today," I said, laying out a map on a relatively dry patch of ground. "Let's fish this lake, get some fresh food, and maybe explore the immediate area on foot." The others agreed readily. None of us were particularly eager to get back on the water so soon after the storm. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, one of the few food items that hadn't been affected by the rain, we gathered our fishing gear and set off along the shoreline. The forest was alive with post-storm activity. Birds called energetically to one another. Small animals rustled through the underbrush and water dripped from the canopy above, creating a continuous ambient soundtrack. We walked in companionable silence, taking in the sights and sounds, occasionally stopping to inspect interesting flora or fauna. "I wonder if the storm drove the fish deeper," Jack mused as we navigated around a fallen tree. "Might be harder to catch anything today." "Only one way to find out," David replied, patting his tackle box. We had been walking for approximately half a mile when William, who was leading the group, suddenly stopped. His posture stiffened, and he raised a hand to signal us to halt. "What is it?" I asked, moving to stand beside him. When I saw what had caught his attention, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Ahead of us, partially obscured by the trees, was another campsite. Unlike our hastily established storm shelter, this one appeared to be a proper setup, or at least it had been. Now it was in a state of complete disarray. Cautiously, we approached the site. The scene that greeted us was disturbing on multiple levels. Several tents lay collapsed and torn, their contents spilled across the ground. Personal belongings, clothing, backpacks, cooking utensils were scattered haphazardly as if thrown in panic. A fire pit in the center of the clearing contained the cold, sodden remains of what must have been a decent-sized campfire. "What happened here?" Jack whispered, his voice tense. None of us had an answer. We moved through the site slowly, taking in the details with growing concern. The most striking aspect was the presence of almost all the camping essentials. Canoes secured on the shore, food supplies, though many containers were ripped open, clothing and gear. It appeared as though whoever had been camping here had left in extreme haste, abandoning valuable equipment in the process. "Look at this," David called from near one of the larger trees. He was pointing upward, where a food bag hung suspended from a high branch at least 20 to 25 feet above the ground. The bag had been torn open, its contents now feeding the forest floor. "That's strange," I remarked, examining the setup. "They hoisted their food properly to keep it from bears, but how did it get torn open at that height?" William finished my thought. "No ordinary black bear could reach that, even if it climbed the tree." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but present in all our minds. If a bear hadn't done this, what had? We continued our investigation, the fishing trip completely forgotten. Among the scattered belongings, we found a weather-resistant journal, its pages damp but mostly legible. The entries detailed a trip similar to ours. 3 people, all male, planning to spend 10 days exploring the boundary waters. The final entry was dated just 2 days prior to our discovery. "Weather turning bad," I read aloud. "Securing camp for the night. Heard strange noises in the forest earlier. Rick thinks it's just wildlife, but Ben isn't convinced. I'm setting extra precautions tonight just in case." The entry ended there, providing no clue as to what had transpired afterward, or why the campsite now lay in ruins. "Should we call this in?" Jack asked, gesturing to the satellite phone secured in a waterproof case on his belt. "I think we should," I agreed. "Something serious happened here, and whoever was camping might need help." David made the call using our satellite phone, connecting to the helicopter service we had contracted for our eventual extraction. The conversation was hampered by intermittent static, but he managed to convey the essential details: our location and the discovery of an abandoned campsite in disarray. "They say they haven't received any distress calls or reports of missing hikers in this area," David informed us after ending the call. "They're checking with local authorities to see if anyone's been reported missing, but for now they're advising us to continue our trip as planned." The response felt inadequate given what we were looking at. 3 people had clearly left this campsite in a hurry, abandoning valuable equipment and possibly their only means of transportation, the canoes still secured to the shore. Their disappearance had apparently gone unreported, which suggested either they had managed to reach civilization by some other means, or no one yet realized they were missing. "I don't like this," William said, voicing the sentiment we all shared. "Something feels wrong." We spent the next hour methodically searching the campsite and its immediate surroundings for any clue that might explain what had happened. The ground, still soft from the previous night's rain, held numerous footprints, some clearly human, others less distinct. Several sets of human prints led from the tents toward the forest line, suggesting a hasty departure in that direction. "These look like they were made in a hurry," Jack observed, crouching to examine the impressions. "Look at the depth and spacing. Whoever made these was running." "Running from what, though?" I asked, scanning the tree line with newfound apprehension. We followed the footprints into the forest for about 50 yards before they became indistinct on the harder ground beneath the canopy. The trail effectively went cold, leaving us with more questions than answers. Returning to the campsite, we debated our next course of action. The discovery had cast a shadow over our trip, introducing an element of unease that hadn't existed before. Even the forest around us, which had seemed so welcoming just hours earlier, now took on a more sinister aspect. "We have two options," I said, trying to maintain a level head. "We can pack up our camp and move to a different location, putting some distance between us and whatever happened here, or we can head back the way we came and cut the trip short." "I vote we move," David said after a moment's consideration. "I'm not ready to end the trip, but I don't want to stay near this place either." Jack and William nodded in agreement. None of us were willing to admit defeat. But the abandoned campsite had undeniably affected our sense of security. By mutual consensus, we decided to return to our temporary camp, gather our belongings, and paddle to a new location before nightfall. As we prepared to leave the abandoned site, I felt compelled to document it. Using the waterproof camera we had brought for the trip, I took several photographs of the scene: the torn tents, the scattered belongings, the hoisted food bag. Something told me these images might be important later, though for what purpose I couldn't say. We left the site exactly as we had found it, in case the authorities needed to investigate. The walk back to our camp was notably different from our earlier trek, where before we had moved with ease, enjoying the post-storm freshness. Now we proceeded with caution, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest, ears attuned to every sound. The wilderness, once a source of joy and rejuvenation, had revealed its potential for mystery and danger. We returned to our campsite and immediately began breaking it down, working with efficient urgency born of our shared unease. The tents came down quickly, followed by the careful packing of our gear into waterproof bags. Within an hour, we were loading the canoes, eager to put distance between ourselves and the disturbing discovery we had made. "Where to?" Jack asked as we pushed off from the shore, the afternoon sun still high enough to give us several hours of paddling time. "Let's head east," I suggested, consulting the map. "There's a smaller lake about 2 hours from here with several islands. We can set up camp on one of them." The logic behind my suggestion wasn't stated but understood by all. An island would provide greater visibility and security, with water serving as a natural barrier on all sides. The others nodded in agreement, and we set our course accordingly. The paddle was strenuous, partly due to the lingering effects of the storm on the water conditions and partly because of our collective desire to reach our destination quickly. Conversation was minimal, each of us lost in our thoughts about what we had witnessed. Around mid-afternoon, we reached the channel that would lead us to the smaller lake. The passage was narrow, flanked by steep rock faces on both sides, creating a natural corridor through which water flowed at a slightly increased rate. Navigating it required concentration and coordination between the pairs in each canoe. As we emerged from the channel into the open water of the new lake, a sense of relief washed over me. The lake was as I had hoped, smaller than the one we had left behind but still substantial, with several tree-covered islands dotting its surface. We made for the largest of these, located roughly in the center of the lake. Upon reaching the island, we discovered it was an ideal campsite, elevated enough to provide good drainage, with a natural clearing surrounded by tall pines that would offer shelter from the wind. Most importantly, it offered clear visibility in all directions, a feature that now seemed more valuable than ever. We established our new camp with methodical precision, setting up the tents, organizing our gear, and preparing a central fire pit. By the time the sun began to set, we had created a semblance of normalcy and security, yet beneath the routine actions, I could sense a new vigilance in all of us. David positioned his tent to face the water, providing a view of any approach. William arranged our canoes with unusual care, ensuring they could be quickly accessed if needed. Jack took inventory of our supplies, paying particular attention to our emergency equipment. As darkness fell, we gathered around the newly lit campfire, the flames casting long shadows across the clearing. The warmth and light provided some comfort, but the conversation inevitably returned to what we had discovered earlier that day. "What do you think happened to them?" William asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Maybe they just got spooked by the storm and decided to hike out," Jack offered, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe his own explanation. "And leave everything behind, including their canoes?" David countered. "That doesn't make sense. The nearest road or settlement has to be at least 20 miles from here." I remained silent, considering the journal entry I had read. The mention of strange noises and extra precautions suggested that whatever had prompted their departure had been building before the storm hit. It wasn't a spontaneous decision driven by bad weather. Could it have been a bear? William suggested. Maybe they heard one approaching and panicked. Possible, I conceded, but unlikely. Experienced campers would know that making noise usually scares bears away, and they wouldn't abandon their camp entirely. They'd wait it out somewhere nearby and return when it was safe. A heavy silence settled over us as we contemplated the implications. Something had frightened 3 experienced outdoorsmen enough to make them flee into the forest in the middle of the night, leaving behind essential equipment and their primary means of transportation. Whatever it was, it had been sufficient to override their training and instincts for wilderness survival. As the night deepened, our conversation dwindled, replaced by the sounds of the forest around us, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional call of a nocturnal bird. Under normal circumstances, these sounds would have been soothing, a natural lullaby against which to fall asleep. Now they served as a constant reminder of our isolation and vulnerability. We established a watch rotation for the night, something we hadn't deemed necessary earlier in our trip. 2 hours each, rotating through all 4 of us, ensuring that someone was always awake and alert. It was a precaution born of unease rather than any specific threat, but it provided a measure of comfort nonetheless. My watch came third in the rotation, from midnight to 2 a.m. When Jack woke me for my shift, I could see the weariness in his expression, not just from lack of sleep but from the strain of heightened vigilance. "Anything?" I asked quietly, sitting up in my sleeping bag. He shook his head. "Nothing unusual, just the usual forest sounds." I nodded, grateful for the uneventful report, and moved to take his place by the dying embers of the fire. Jack retreated to his tent, leaving me alone with the night. The first hour of my watch passed slowly. I maintained the fire at a low burn, providing just enough light to monitor the immediate surroundings without compromising my night vision. Every so often I would walk the perimeter of our camp, scanning the water and the tree line for any sign of movement or disturbance. It was during one such patrol, approximately an hour into my watch, that I first noticed it, a faint sound coming from the mainland to the north of our island. Initially, I dismissed it as wind through the trees or an animal moving through the underbrush. But as I listened more intently, the sound became more distinct. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical in its consistency. Instinctively, I reached for the high-powered flashlight we kept for emergencies. Pointing it toward the source of the sound, I switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the tree line on the mainland. A flicker of movement, a disruption in the natural pattern of shadows. But when I focused the beam directly on that spot, there was nothing there. I remained frozen, flashlight trained on the tree line, straining to see or hear anything definitive. The rhythmic sound had stopped the moment I switched on the light. Now there was only silence, more complete and oppressive than before. After several minutes of watching and listening, I convinced myself that it had been nothing more than my imagination, heightened by the events of the day and the general atmosphere of unease. I returned to the fire, but the sense of being observed lingered, an itch at the back of my neck that refused to subside. When William emerged from his tent to relieve me at 2 a.m., I debated whether to mention what I had heard. In the end, I decided against it. Without concrete evidence, I would only be adding to the collective anxiety. Instead, I briefed him on the uneventful aspects of my watch and returned to my tent, hoping for a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. But sleep, when it came, was fitful and disturbed by fragmented dreams, running through endless forests, pursuing or being pursued by unseen entities, the sound of tearing fabric and splintering wood echoing through the dreamscape. I woke several times, momentarily disoriented, before the reality of our situation came flooding back. Dawn arrived with a mist hanging over the lake, reducing visibility and adding to the general sense of isolation. We emerged from our tents one by one, bleary-eyed and subdued. The watches had taken their toll, disrupting our sleep patterns and leaving us fatigued. "Coffee first. Then we talk," David declared, setting up the portable stove to boil water. We sat in a tight circle, cups of steaming instant coffee in hand, the warming beverage doing little to dispel the chill that had settled into our bones. a chill that had less to do with the morning temperature and more with our mental state. "Did anyone hear anything unusual during their watch?" William asked, breaking the silence. Jack and David shook their heads. I hesitated, then decided to share what I had experienced. "I heard something during my shift," I admitted. "A rhythmic sound coming from the mainland to the north. When I shined the flashlight in that direction, it stopped, and I thought I saw movement in the tree line, but I couldn't be sure." The revelation was met with concerned glances. No one dismissed my account or suggested it was merely my imagination, which in itself was telling. We had all been affected by the discovery of the abandoned campsite. Our collective perception shifted toward hypervigilance. "I think we need to make a decision," I continued. "Do we continue the trip as planned, or do we call for an early extraction?" The question hung in the air, carrying the weight of our shared unease. We had invested significant time, money, and emotional energy in this adventure. Cutting it short felt like an admission of defeat, a capitulation to fear rather than a rational response to danger. Yet the evidence we had encountered, the abandoned camp, the inexplicable flight of its occupants, the strange sounds in the night, suggested that caution might be the wiser course. "I vote we call it," William said finally. "Whatever happened to those guys, I don't want it happening to us. We've had a good week out here. Let's not push our luck." Jack nodded in agreement. "As much as I hate to end early, I haven't felt right since we found that camp. I'm constantly on edge, expecting something to happen. That's not what this trip was supposed to be about." David was the last to weigh in. He had been the most enthusiastic about the expedition from the beginning, the one who had suggested the boundary waters as our destination. His reluctance to abandon the adventure was evident in his expression, but eventually he too nodded. "Safety first," he conceded. "If we're all this unsettled, we're not going to enjoy the rest of the trip anyway. Let's call for extraction tomorrow morning. That gives us one more day out here, and we can use it to paddle closer to one of the designated pickup points." With the decision made, a subtle shift occurred in our collective mood. The pressure of uncertainty was replaced by the practicalities of planning our exit. We studied the maps, identifying the nearest extraction point where a helicopter could land safely. It was a clearing on the western shore of a larger lake, approximately a 6-hour paddle from our current position. If we leave after breakfast tomorrow, we should reach the extraction point by mid-afternoon, I calculated. Then we can set up camp and be ready for pickup the following morning. The plan was sound and provided a clear structure for our remaining time in the wilderness. Yet as we went about our day, fishing for our meals, maintaining the camp, preparing for the following day's journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Every rustle in the underbrush, every call of a bird, every ripple on the water's surface seemed to carry a message, a warning that I couldn't quite decipher. That night, we again established a watch rotation, though with the decision to leave, the purpose was as much psychological as practical. Having someone awake and alert provided comfort to those trying to sleep, a human sentinel against the unknown. My shift came second this time, from 10 p.m. to midnight. Jack handed over the watch with a whispered, "All quiet," before retreating to his tent. I settled by the fire, adding a few small logs to maintain a steady flame. The night was clear, the mist of the morning having dissipated completely, leaving a canvas of stars overhead. For the first hour of my watch, the only sounds were those typical of a forest at night, the soft hooting of an owl, the distant splash of a fish jumping in the lake, the gentle creaking of tree branches in the light breeze. I had almost convinced myself that the previous night's experience had been a product of an overactive imagination when I heard it again. The rhythmic sound, clearer now than before, emanating from the same direction as the previous night. It was a repeated pattern, 3 rapid successions followed by a pause, then repeated. It reminded me of Morse code, though it followed no pattern I recognized. This time I didn't immediately reach for the flashlight. Instead, I moved quietly to wake David, whose tent was closest to my position. "Listen," I whispered when he was fully alert. He cocked his head, focusing on the sounds of the night. When the rhythmic pattern began again, his eyes widened slightly, confirming that it wasn't just in my head. "Wake the others," he whispered back. Quietly. Within minutes, all 4 of us were awake and alert. listening intently to the mysterious sound. It continued at regular intervals, neither approaching nor receding, maintaining its position somewhere in the mainland forest. "What do you think it is?" William asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's the same sound I heard last night, and it's coming from the same direction." "Could it be another camper?" Jack suggested. "Maybe sending a signal or using some kind of equipment." "At this hour? In this location?" David countered skeptically. "We haven't seen any signs of other campers for days, and this area is pretty remote." The discussion might have continued if not for what happened next. The rhythmic sound suddenly ceased, replaced by a different noise, a sustained low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath our feet. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, neither animal nor machine, yet somehow reminiscent of both. We stood frozen, listening as the rumble persisted for several long seconds before gradually fading away. In its wake, an unnatural silence descended as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Call for extraction now," William said, his voice tight with suppressed fear. "I don't want to wait until morning." None of us argued. The satellite phone was retrieved from its waterproof case, and David made the call, explaining our change of plans and requesting the earliest possible pickup. There was a brief discussion about night extraction risks, but ultimately, the helicopter service agreed to dispatch a pilot at first light, approximately 5 hours from our call. "They're coming at dawn," David reported after ending the call. "We need to be ready to move to the extraction point as soon as there's enough light to navigate safely." The remainder of the night was spent in a state of tense readiness. We packed our essential gear, leaving only what we would need for a quick breakfast and the short journey to the extraction point. No one suggested returning to sleep. The prospect seemed absurd given the circumstances. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. We maintained a larger fire than usual, finding comfort in its light and warmth. The mysterious sounds did not return, but their absence provided little reassurance. If anything, the silence felt expectant, as if the forest was waiting for something to occur. The first hint of dawn appeared as a faint lightening of the eastern sky, a gradual transition from black to deep blue. We had been awake for hours, our nerves frayed by the night's events and the anticipation of departure. The moment there was sufficient light to navigate safely, we loaded our gear into the canoes and pushed off from the island's shore. The morning mist had returned, creating an ethereal landscape of half-seen shapes and muted sounds. We paddled in tight formation, each canoe within arm's reach of the other, taking comfort in our proximity. The extraction point was closer than we had initially planned, a small clearing on the eastern shore of our current lake, chosen for its accessibility and the relative flatness of the terrain. We reached it just as the sun was beginning to burn through the morning mist, casting long shadows across the water. The clearing was as described by the helicopter service, a natural opening in the forest with enough space for a small aircraft to land safely. We beached our canoes and unloaded our gear, setting up a temporary camp to await our rescue. The satellite phone buzzed with a message from the pilot, confirming they were en route and approximately 30 minutes from our location. The news brought a palpable sense of relief, a confirmation that our ordeal was nearing its end. As we waited, we discussed what to do about the abandoned campsite we had discovered. The consensus was to report it to the park authorities once we returned to civilization, providing the photographs I had taken and our best estimate of its location. It seemed important somehow to ensure that someone looked into the fate of those 3 campers, even if our direct involvement was coming to an end. The sound of the approaching helicopter reached us before we could see it, a distant thudding that gradually increased in volume. Then suddenly it appeared through a gap in the tree canopy, a bright yellow machine that represented safety and a return to the world we knew. The pilot set down in the clearing with practiced ease, the downdraft from the rotors creating a mini whirlwind of leaves and pine needles. After a brief exchange with the crew, we loaded our gear into the storage compartment and climbed aboard, securing ourselves in the seats provided. As the helicopter lifted off, I gazed down at the wilderness below, the vast network of lakes and forests that had been our home for the past week. From this vantage point, it looked peaceful, benign even. It was hard to reconcile the beauty with the sense of dread that had prompted our early departure. The journey back to civilization was largely silent, each of us lost in our thoughts about what we had experienced. The relief of rescue was tempered by a lingering unease, a sense that we were carrying something back with us from the wilderness, not a physical artifact, but a question that had no clear answer. Upon our return, we reported the abandoned campsite to the park authorities as planned. They took our statements and the photographs, promising to investigate. A week later, we received a follow-up call informing us that they had located the site based on our description, but there was no sign of the missing campers. A search of the surrounding area had yielded no results, and without a formal missing persons report, there was little more they could do. In the months that followed, I occasionally checked news sources for any reports of hikers or campers gone missing in the Boundary Waters. Nothing that matched our experience ever surfaced. It was as if those 3 men had simply vanished, leaving behind only the disrupted camp as evidence of their existence. The 4 of us, Jack, David, William, and I, remained friends, but we never again discussed a return to the Boundary Waters. Our subsequent outdoor adventures took us to different locations, ones with more human presence and less isolation. The unspoken agreement seemed to be that while we couldn't explain what had happened, we had no desire to risk encountering it again. To this day, 5 years later, I find myself thinking about that abandoned campsite and the events that followed. The rhythmic sounds in the night, the rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, the oppressive silence that descended afterward, all elements of an experience that defies conventional explanation. I've considered various theories over the years. Perhaps it was indeed a bear attack, albeit one with unusual circumstances. Maybe the campers encountered hostile individuals in the wilderness, though the remoteness of the location makes this unlikely. Natural phenomena, sudden flooding, unexpected quicksand, or some geological event, might explain their disappearance, but not the state of the camp or the sounds we heard. In my darkest moments, usually when sleep proves elusive in the early hours of the morning, I contemplate more disturbing possibilities. What if there's something in those remote forests that remains unknown to modern science? Not a supernatural entity. I've never been inclined toward such beliefs, but perhaps an animal or natural phenomenon that has yet to be documented or understood. Whatever the truth, the experience left an indelible mark on me. I still enjoy outdoor activities, still find solace in nature's beauty, but always with a heightened awareness of its potential dangers. The boundary between wilderness and civilization, once so clear in my mind, now seems more permeable, more complex. Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson from our truncated adventure, a newfound respect for the unknowable aspects of the natural world, an acknowledgement that despite our maps, our GPS devices, our satellite phones, and our carefully crafted gear, there are still mysteries in the wild places of this earth, and sometimes wisdom lies not in solving those mysteries, but in recognizing when to withdraw, when to acknowledge the limits of our understanding and control. The abandoned campsite remains, in my memory, a testament to this wisdom, a reminder that in the vast wilderness, it is we who are the visitors, the transient presence. The forest was there long before we arrived, and it will remain long after we depart, harboring its secrets with patient indifference to our fleeting curiosity and fear. Ever since I was a little girl, geology has always been my one true passion. It started when I was 7 years old, when my dad took me and my brother on a family camping trip to Mammoth Cave National Park in my home state of Kentucky. We didn't go specifically to see the caves, but since it's a huge attraction in the park, enough so that it's named after it, we decided to go along to see what all the fuss was about, and it was a visit that would have a lasting impact on the rest of my life. At first, even though we were on a guided tour accompanied by a park ranger, I was genuinely frightened. We were walking down into this dark, dingy space unfit for human habitation, and to 7-year-old me, it could have been home to any number of terrifying subterranean monsters. Once I realized that we were just as safe below the earth as we were on the surface, the fear mellowed into a tingling excitement that had a profound effect on me. It felt like we were treading into some hallowed, forbidden space, with the stalactites and stalagmites giving the place an otherworldly, alien feel. And from that day forward, I was hooked. I was that kid in high school who waxed lyrical about their collection of geodes, and every single accessory I owned was bejeweled with either rose quartz, azurite, amethyst, or pyrite. God forbid you complimented me on any of them, because you'd always get an earful of what kind of stone it was, where it came from, or how it was formed. Naturally, I had my heart set on getting a degree in geology before I'd even entered into high school, and after a few blissful years of immersing myself in my favorite subject, I decided I didn't want to leave. That's how I ended up becoming a research fellow at the University of New Mexico's Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, with my specialty being field research. However, it was through my field research that I ended up going on the second caving trip that ended up changing my life. And unlike my first, which undoubtedly changed my life for the better, the second ended up changing it for the worse. In 2014, I was presented with the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance at conducting research in the Lechuguilla cave system near Carlsbad, New Mexico. To understand why this was such an amazing opportunity for me, I have to give you a little bit of backstory regarding the cave's history, and since I feel like I've already given you my life story, I'll try to keep it as short and sweet as possible. Up until the mid-80s, geologists believed that Lechuguilla was just a small, insignificant cave, full of nothing but dry, dead-end passages. But in 1984, a group of cavers discovered that not only was Lechuguilla actually the 8th longest cave system in the world, but it was the deepest in the entire United States. So far, geologists have mapped over 150 miles of caves and tunnels that extend almost half a mile beneath the earth, and it's still not completely explored. Access is limited to approved scientific researchers, survey and exploration teams, and it can sometimes take literally years for the Bureau of Land Management to grant permission to conduct a research assignment. Knowing how restricted access to Lechuguilla was, I'm sure you can imagine my excitement when I heard that not only was it our department that had been granted permission, but I was one of the researchers chosen to conduct fieldwork. Even so, all was not set in stone, and I had to jump through several hoops to guarantee my place on the team. As some of you might know, caving can be extremely dangerous even to experienced field researchers such as myself. With that in mind, each potential member of the field team was subjected to a rigorous medical examination to ensure they were fit enough to be chosen. Obviously, this was for both insurance and security purposes, as no one with any underlying medical conditions could be allowed to potentially jeopardize such an important field trip. The psychological evaluation was equally intense. 3 separate sessions with the university psychologist, a battery of standardized tests, and a final evaluation by the department head. I can still remember the tension I felt waiting for the results. The email arrived at 3:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. I wasn't sleeping anyway. The anticipation had me checking my inbox every 20 minutes. When I saw the words Lechuguilla Research Team confirmed participants, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my phone. My name was there, 4th on the list. I remember pressing my hand against my mouth to keep from screaming with joy and waking my roommate. I'd made it. I was going to Lechuguilla. The selection process had whittled our original pool of 12 candidates down to just 4. Not only were we some of the brightest and best in our field, we were also some of the fittest and most mentally sound researchers in the entire United States. We felt like the elite forces of geology or something, like we were the best of the best, but being the fittest and most competent couldn't stop what would happen to us down there in Lechuguilla. The events of that field trip have haunted me for almost 9 long years now. Over the next 6 weeks, I prepared obsessively. I doubled my regular workouts, focusing on core strength and flexibility. I studied every available map of the cave system, memorizing the known passages, junctions, and chambers. I practiced with the specialized equipment we'd be using, getting comfortable with the weight and feel of it. I even started sleeping on the floor occasionally, conditioning my body for the hard surfaces we'd encounter below. The field team consisted of myself, a fellow UNM researcher and longtime mentor named Joaquin, and 2 other field researchers, one from Louisiana State University and another from the University of Texas at Austin, both of whom shall remain nameless for reasons that will become obvious. We met twice before our eventual drive over to White City, and each time I remember walking away thinking very highly of the 2 researchers from Texas and Louisiana. Both guys were true field geologists, had both passed the medical exams, and both seemed like they could handle the outdoors enough to camp in the desert for a week. The LSU researcher particularly impressed me. He was in his early 40s with 15 years of caving experience in some of the most challenging systems in North America. He had an easy confidence about him, the kind that comes from genuine expertise rather than bravado. When he spoke about cave formations or geological processes, everyone listened. He had a particular interest in the unusual sulfuric acid dissolution that had formed lechuguilla, a process dramatically different from how most caves develop. The UT Austin researcher was younger, maybe 30. With boundless enthusiasm and a brilliant analytical mind, he specialized in microbiology and was eager to study the unique bacteria that thrive in lechuguilla's isolated environment. Some of these microorganisms had been sealed away from the surface for millions of years, evolving in complete isolation, and he believed they might hold medical significance, perhaps even novel antibiotics. Joaquin, my mentor, was approaching retirement but remained as physically capable as researchers half his age. He had a weathered face that crinkled around the eyes when he laughed, which was often. Despite his cheerful demeanor, he was meticulous in his preparations, checking and double-checking our equipment with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly how dangerous our undertaking would be. By the time it came for us all to meet up in White City, I felt very confident that the field trip was going to go off without a hitch. The plan was to hike from White City to the entrance of the Lechuguilla cave system, set up camp just outside of it, then use the camp as our field HQ while spending several days working our way in and out of the cave, gradually getting deeper as the days went on. The morning of our departure arrived with a spectacular New Mexico sunrise, the sky ablaze with orange and pink as we loaded the final supplies into our vehicles. The drive to the trailhead was filled with animated discussion about the research ahead, and by the time we began our hike, my excitement was nearly overwhelming. The entrance to Lechuguilla is unassuming, a small, unremarkable opening in the limestone that gives no hint of the vast network beneath. We set up our base camp efficiently, each of us falling into our assigned roles. Joaquin supervised the establishment of our communications equipment, ensuring we could maintain contact with the surface team, who would be monitoring our expedition. For the first few days, it was one of the most incredible field trips I've ever been on. The research was electric, the subject matter titanic, and the people I was with were all the very best at what they did. I think I soaked up more knowledge and experience from them in a few days than I had over the past 18 months. It was nothing short of heaven. On our first day below, we explored only the upper levels, areas that had been well mapped and studied. Even so, the beauty was breathtaking. Delicate crystalline formations hung from the ceilings and rose from the floors in impossible shapes. The light from our headlamps caught the mineral deposits, sending rainbows dancing across the walls. The cave seemed to breathe around us, the subtle air currents causing minute changes in temperature that you could feel on your skin if you stood still enough. We collected samples methodically, photographing and documenting everything according to protocol. The UT Austin researcher was particularly animated, discovering several colonies of bacteria that he hadn't expected to find at this level. His enthusiasm was contagious, and even Joaquin, who had seen more caves than the rest of us combined, seemed reinvigorated by his excitement. Each night we emerged from the cave exhausted but fulfilled, sharing our findings around the campfire, planning the next day's expedition, and sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence beneath the vast desert sky. The contrast between the enclosed world below and the infinite expanse above was striking, a reminder of the different scales at which our planet operates. As we ventured deeper on the second and third days, the cave revealed more of its secrets. We descended through narrow passages that opened suddenly into vast chambers, some large enough to house a cathedral. The formations became more exotic. Curtains of flowstone that rippled like frozen waterfalls, delicate helictites that defied gravity, growing horizontally or even upward in curious spirals. The silence down there was absolute. When we turned off our lights and stopped moving, the darkness and quiet were so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. In those moments, I understood why early humans regarded caves with such reverence and fear. There is something primal about being so deep within the earth, cut off from the sun, dependent entirely on your own resources and preparation. But despite the inherent unease of our surroundings, those first 3 days were marked by discovery and camaraderie. We worked well together, each contributing their expertise, supporting one another through the physically demanding traverses. The LSU researcher in particular seemed in his element, moving through the most challenging passages with ease, pointing out geological features the rest of us might have missed. None of us could have predicted how drastically everything would change on the fourth day. The fourth day began like the others. We ate breakfast together, reviewed our research objectives, and checked our equipment before entering the cave. Our plan was to push deeper than we had before, into an area that had been mapped but not extensively studied. The LSU researcher was especially eager, mentioning a particular chamber he wanted to examine that was known for its unusual mineral formations. The descent took nearly 3 hours. We moved carefully through a series of tight squeezes, rappelled down a 40-foot vertical shaft, and traversed a narrow ledge above a seemingly bottomless pit. The effort was worth it when we arrived at our destination, a massive chamber with walls that glittered with enormous gypsum crystals, some nearly transparent and longer than my arm. We worked methodically throughout the day, each focusing on our specific research areas. I was documenting a series of unusual erosion patterns that suggested periodic flooding in the distant past, while Joaquin collected mineral samples for later analysis. The UT Austin researcher carefully swabbed various surfaces, preserving bacterial samples in sealed containers. The LSU researcher moved somewhat apart from us, examining a series of small side passages that branched off from the main chamber. I noticed him spending a long time at one particular opening, shining his light into it from different angles, occasionally making notes but mostly just staring. When Joaquin called out that we should begin our return journey, he seemed reluctant to leave. As we made our ascent, he was unusually quiet. While the rest of us discussed our findings excitedly, he responded only in monosyllables, his mind clearly elsewhere. Back at camp, he barely touched his dinner and excused himself early, saying he needed to review his notes. I should explain that on that evening, after we had all retired to our tents, our colleague from LSU went back into the caves. We were all absolutely exhausted from the day's caving, but for some reason, he wanted to head back into Lechuguilla to explore a little deeper into the tunnel that we hadn't fully investigated yet. Generally speaking, solo caving is extremely frowned upon. It's seen as irresponsible and overly dangerous, as if you get stuck or trapped somewhere, there's no one to help you or report that you're missing. But since this guy was easily one of the most experienced cavers any of us had ever worked with, we figured he'd have the sense not to get himself into any dangerous situations. So off he went, down into the caves to do a little extra research. He'd said that it'd be 2 hours at the most and that he'd be back well before sundown. But those 2 hours came and went without any word from him. Like I said, he was very experienced, but after 2 hours became 3 and almost 4. We started getting pretty worried about him. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a wind had picked up, sending swirls of dust through our campsite. Joaquin tried to raise him on the radio several times, but there was no response. Not unusual given the depth and composition of the cave, which often blocked signals. We debated whether to go after him, with Joaquin arguing that he was experienced enough to handle himself, while the UT researcher and I felt we should at least check the entrance. Finally, we compromised. We would give him 1 more hour, and if he hadn't returned by then, we'd alert the surface support team and prepare a search. We spent that hour in tense silence, each of us imagining worst-case scenarios: a fall, a cave-in, equipment failure. And right before we were gearing up to head down into the cave after him, he suddenly reappeared, looking extremely pale. We asked if everything was okay, expecting to hear some story about a close call in a tunnel, something of that nature. But to our surprise, he told us that he was fine, and that he'd found something after exploring one of the caves that was very pertinent to our research. When we asked him what it was, and if he'd taken any pictures or video, he shook his head, saying if he had known he was going to run into it, he'd have brought a camera. We asked him again what it was that he'd seen, and after struggling to find the words, all he'd tell us was, "You guys gotta see this to believe it." His appearance was deeply unsettling. Though he insisted he was uninjured, he looked physically ill. His skin had a grayish tinge, and a fine sheen of sweat covered his face despite the cool night air. His eyes were the most disturbing, wide and unfocused, darting around as if tracking the movement of something the rest of us couldn't see. For the final few hours that we were awake, we pressed him on exactly what it was, and the more he refused to put it into words, the more I found a deep suspicion growing inside of me. From my perspective, the idea that an experienced geologist and caver was simply incapable of describing what he saw was nothing short of impossible, and at the time there was only one explanation for his behavior. I thought he wanted to guard what he'd seen so he could gain personal prestige from the find. But there was also something very unsettling about his behavior, and that was how frightened he seemed to be as a result of his discovery. It was like he didn't want to show us because he was afraid of what might happen. But at the time, I simply dismissed this as a kind of selfish, greedy glory-seeking, but how wrong I was. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The wind had intensified, making the tent walls flutter and snap. But it wasn't just the noise keeping me awake. It was the memory of our colleague's face, the haunted look in his eyes. I kept replaying his words in my mind, trying to imagine what could possibly have affected him so strongly. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful doze only to be jolted awake by sounds of a struggle. At first, it just sounded like they were engaged in a heated but hushed argument of some kind in the tent that the LSU and the UT Austin researchers were sharing. The canvas walls muffled their words, but the intensity was clear, sharp whispers rising occasionally into strained, urgent tones. I lay still, telling myself it was none of my business, just a disagreement between colleagues. Then I heard a yelp of what sounded like pain, followed by a series of thumping sounds, a body hitting the ground, thrashing. I grabbed my flashlight and scrambled out of my sleeping bag. I quickly woke Joaquin from his sleep and told him what I was hearing. And when he heard some horrific sort of wheezing sound, he ran out of our tent and over to the other. When he pulled open the flap, the beam of his headlamp illuminated a scene that branded itself permanently into my memory. The LSU researcher was straddling the chest of the UT Austin researcher, his hands clamped around his throat. The younger man's face was purple, his eyes bulging, feet drumming against the ground in desperate, weakening kicks. What struck me most wasn't just the violence of the act, but the expression on the LSU researcher's face. It wasn't rage or hatred, it was terror. Pure, unadulterated terror, as if he wasn't trying to kill his colleague, but rather some horrific thing that only he could see. He knows. He knows. He kept repeating in a voice that sounded nothing like his own. Higher, strained, almost childlike in its panic. I can't let him tell. I can't let any of you know what's down there. It took all our strength to separate them, but by then it was far too late. Joaquin tackled him from the side while I tried to pry his fingers from the younger man's throat. His strength was unnatural, fueled by whatever madness had seized him. The UT researcher had gone limp, his lips blue, a trickle of blood running from his nose. When we finally managed to break his grip, Joaquin immediately began CPR on the unconscious researcher, while I tried to restrain his attacker. But the man was beyond reason, thrashing and scratching, his eyes wild and unfocused. He kept muttering, sometimes in coherent sentences, sometimes in fragmented phrases that made no sense. The walls, moving, breathing. They've been down there all along, watching us, studying us. They know we know. The UT Austin researcher has since suffered irreparable brain damage as a result of oxygen starvation. It's more likely that he'll never walk or eat unassisted for the remainder of his life. The LSU researcher was impossible to restrain, even once we pulled him off the other researcher. We tried everything we could to hold him down, but in the end, Joaquin was left with a split lip and my nose was completely shattered after the deranged man slammed his forehead into my face. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot explosion across my face that momentarily blinded me. I fell back, hands clutching my shattered nose, warm blood pouring between my fingers. Through watering eyes, I saw him break from Joaquin's grip with a violent twist, knocking my mentor to the ground. And then he was running, not toward the trail that would lead back to civilization, but toward the cave entrance. Without a helmet, without a light, without supplies, he plunged into the darkness as if something was pulling him in, the night swallowing him whole. After he broke from our grip, we're almost certain that he ran back into the cave without any food, water, or protective clothing, and that is the last time we ever saw him. We were in no rush to pursue him, after all. Didn't think that he could just up and disappear in there. Even if all the tunnels are unexplored, there's still a limited amount of space where a person might try to hide themselves. Our focus was getting the UT Austin researcher the medical attention he needed, but even so, We just couldn't get him to a hospital in time to prevent permanent damage. The hours that followed blur together in my memory, a montage of desperate measures and crushing realizations. Joaquin continued CPR until the UT researcher began breathing again, but it was shallow and irregular. We used our satellite phone to call for emergency evacuation, but we were hours from the nearest hospital. I remember cradling the young researcher's head in my lap during the long wait for help, watching his chest rise and fall in uneven patterns, noticing how the vibrant intelligence had already vanished from his half-open eyes. Joaquin sat nearby, radio in hand, maintaining contact with the rescue team, his face carved with lines of grief and shock. When the helicopter finally arrived, its rotors whipping the desert sand into stinging clouds, I felt no relief, only a hollow emptiness. As the paramedics loaded our colleague onto a stretcher, one of them asked what had happened. Neither of us knew what to say. How could we explain what we didn't understand ourselves? Dawn was breaking by the time they departed, the sky lightening to a pale blue that seemed obscenely beautiful given what had transpired. Joaquin and I stood in silence, watching until the helicopter was nothing but a dark speck against the horizon. "We have to report this," he said finally, his voice roughened by exhaustion. "And we have to find him." A search and rescue team arrived by mid-morning, 6 professionals with cave rescue training and all the necessary equipment. They listened grimly as we recounted what had happened, their expressions growing increasingly concerned as we described our colleague's behavior. "Could it have been drugs?" one of them asked. "Or maybe a reaction to some fungus or bacteria in the cave?" "He wasn't that kind of person," I said, though doubt had begun to creep in. How well did I really know him? And we were all exposed to the same environment. They organized a systematic search of the upper levels of the cave, but even with their expertise and equipment, the task was daunting. Lechugila's vast network of passages, chambers, and vertical drops made it like searching for a needle in a haystack, especially if the needle was actively trying to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Joaquin and I were questioned separately by police officers who had driven out from Carlsbad. They were clearly skeptical of our account, probing for inconsistencies, asking repeatedly about the relationship between the 2 researchers, whether there had been any previous conflicts. "People don't just snap without a reason," one officer told me, his pen poised above his notepad, "especially not highly educated professionals with no history of violence." I couldn't argue with his logic, but I also couldn't provide the explanation he wanted. All I could do was repeat what we had seen, what little our colleague had said about his discovery, and how drastically his demeanor had changed afterward. The search continued for 3 days. Teams ventured deeper into the cave system than we had gone, exploring side passages and remote chambers. They found no trace of the LSU researcher, no equipment, no clothing, no signs of injury or struggle. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him. On the 4th day, the search was scaled back. Resources were limited, and the chances of finding someone alive after so long in the cave without supplies were vanishingly small. By the end of the week, only a token effort remained: a missing persons report, a promise to check periodically, a folder that would gradually migrate to the back of some filing cabinet. As for the LSU researcher, his body was never recovered. At least I'm assuming they were looking for a body, as there's no way that a person could survive down there for long, not without ample supplies of food and water, neither of which he took with him when he ran off into the night. The academic aftermath was as painful as the physical one. Our research expedition was officially terminated, all our preliminary findings sealed pending investigation. The University of New Mexico distanced itself from the incident, releasing a statement expressing regret, but emphasizing that all proper protocols had been followed. Joaquin retired the following semester, his passion for fieldwork extinguished. We spoke occasionally in the months after, but our conversations were strained, haunted by what remained unsaid. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. I took a leave of absence that stretched into a year, then 2. When I finally returned to academia, it was to a desk job analyzing samples collected by others. My days of fieldwork behind me. The nightmares had subsided somewhat by then, but they never disappeared entirely. In them, I'm always back in that tent, hearing those first sounds of struggle, knowing what's about to happen but unable to move, unable to prevent it. To this day, we don't know what he saw down there, or what happened in the run-up to him strangling our colleague from UT Austin. The cops interviewed the victim when he woke up from the coma, using some of the most advanced communication devices available, but none of what he communicated made any sense. When asked about what happened, his eyes would widen in terror, and the monitors tracking his vital signs would spike alarmingly. After several attempts that resulted in severe anxiety attacks, the questioning was discontinued. I visited him once about a year after the incident. He was in a long-term care facility in Austin, his parents having relocated to be near him. The brilliant, enthusiastic researcher I had known was gone, replaced by a thin, vacant-eyed man who spent his days staring at the wall of his room. The doctors said he showed some recognition of family members, occasionally squeezed a hand in response to questions, but couldn't communicate beyond that. His mother was kind, showing me photos of him as he'd been before, graduating with honors, accepting research awards, smiling broadly on various hiking trips. "We still hope," she said. But the words sounded hollow, a mantra repeated so often it had lost its meaning. The most disturbing moment came as I was leaving. I had reached the door when I heard a sound behind me, a choked guttural noise. I turned to see him looking directly at me, truly seeing me for the first time since I'd arrived. His right hand was raised, index finger extended, pointing not at me but past me, at the empty hallway. His face was contorted in an expression of such profound horror that I felt my own heart race in response. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the awareness vanished from his eyes. His hand dropped, and he returned to his vacant staring. His mother rushed to his side, calling for a nurse while I stood frozen in the doorway, a cold weight settling in my stomach. What had he seen? What was he trying to warn me about? Or was it simply a random firing of damaged neural pathways, meaningless and coincidental? In the years since, I've researched similar incidents, looking for patterns, explanations. I've read about cave gases that can cause hallucinations, rare fungal infections that affect the brain, the psychological effects of prolonged darkness and sensory deprivation. None of it fully explains what happened to us. Occasionally, I hear rumors from the caving community, expeditions into deep systems that ended abruptly, researchers who returned changed in ways they couldn't or wouldn't articulate, sections of caves that remain unexplored despite their scientific interest. When I reach out to those involved, my messages go unanswered, or I receive terse replies that reveal nothing. Once, at a geology conference in Denver, I encountered a researcher who had been part of a recent expedition to Lechuguilla. When I mentioned my experience there, a strange expression crossed his face. Not surprise or curiosity, but a careful blankness, a deliberate neutrality. Certain areas of the cave system have been permanently closed to research, he said, his voice carefully modulated, by order of the Bureau of Land Management, for conservation purposes. When I pressed him for details, which areas, why those specifically, he excused himself and avoided me for the remainder of the conference. What happened that night has haunted me for years, mainly because it remains an almost complete mystery. There's only one thing I'm certain of, though, and that's whatever caused the violent outburst. It was triggered by something the LSU researcher had seen down in the Lechuguilla cave system. And whatever it was, despite all my collegiate curiosity, I sincerely hope it stays buried forever.